Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the Trump administration's tariffs and the impact that they have here in Los Angeles and Orange County. I'm Dr. Richard Downey, the president and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, and it's really a pleasure to have all of you with us today for what I think you'll find to be a very interesting conversation on the impact of these tariffs. Especially since the 2nd of April, Liberation Day, there's been tariffs imposed, paused, changed, and it's caused a lot of uncertainty for businesses, small, large businesses, as well as all of us that are wondering what's going to be on the shelves. So it's a real pleasure to have two terrific speakers here today that their organizations have just done studies, impact studies on this. So we look forward to what their results are in terms of how the impact will be on us here. And I'll introduce each of them in just a moment. But you've heard that saying, all politics is local. And you would think, yes, we're looking at Trump tariffs and the impact on Los Angeles and Orange County. But as our organizations, LAEDC and the Port of Long Beach are focused in the complex of the Los Angeles port and the Port of Long Beach are the busiest in the nation as well as the Western Hemisphere. The impact here, although we're talking about Los Angeles and Orange County, that impact is not just local. It is really across the country and around the world. So so those of you who are not just in Los Angeles, this is probably impacting you as well, and we'll talk about that. We are very fortunate to have two speakers from the Los Angeles Economic Development Corporation, Stephen Cheung, and Ferdinando Guerra, who as I mentioned, I'll introduce them shortly. But we want you to be part of this conversation today, and you can do that at any time by going down to the bottom of your screen. You'll see the Q&A button. You can type in a question there. And what the format for today will be a discussion between Stephen and Nando, and then they'll open it up for your questions and respond to those later on. So before I introduce our speakers, let me just highlight a couple of events that we have coming up that might be of interest to you. We have next week, we have a delegation from the Los Angeles World Affairs Council going to Washington, D.C., where they'll be visiting think tanks, embassies, legislators as representatives of Los Angeles. So that one's full. We're leaving on Sunday, but we're doing another trip, another delegation in October to Taiwan. So if you're interested in doing that, we have 2 spots left only. So if you're interested, please let us know for that one. That's October to Taiwan. On Tuesday, the 27th of May, we have an event with the Consul General of France at his residence in Beverly Hills, where we'll be having a roundtable about French and U.S. relations with Europe. On the 29th, we have a Quad diplomacy event, and that'll be at the City Club here in downtown LA for lunch. And that's with the Consul Generals of Japan, India, as well as Australia, and then a rep from the State Department. Those are the Quad Indo-Pacific relationship there. On the 3rd of June, we have the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, Trita Parsi, who will be talking about the end of the rules-based international order, ? Is it coming? So please, if you're interested in any of these, we have a number more in June, please register on our website or just contact us and we'll get you in. But now let me introduce our speakers. Stephen Cheung is, as Ferdinando mentioned earlier on, everybody knows Stephen, but Stephen, we're so glad to have you with us. Stephen is the president and CEO, not only of LAEDC, the Los Angeles Economic Development Corporation, but also the World Trade Center for Los Angeles. And the mission for those organizations is really to reinvigorate our economy and collaborate to move prosperity and development ahead for this region, for Los Angeles and the region. Stephen was also worked as the Secretary General and Managing Director for International Trade and Foreign Affairs for Mayors Eric Garcetti and Antonio Villaraigosa. And in that role, he managed policies and programs for the Port of Los Angeles, the airport for Los Angeles, international affairs, global trade, and clean technology. So he also managed the mayor's trade missions to a variety of countries and he was also director for trade for the Port of Los Angeles. So although Ferdinando Guerra represents the Port of Long Beach, Stephen's a great representative for the Port of LA as well. And Ferdinando Guerra is the senior economist and geopolitical analyst for the Port of Long Beach. For the last 25 years, he's been working on economic development for the largest metropolitan areas in the United States, here in Los Angeles, in Chicago, and New York. He was formerly the director of economic development for the city of Shafter here in California, which is really the logistics hub for the Western United States. He was also director of research for World Business Chicago. Nando's been a lecturer in economics and political science at Cal State Long Beach, Cal State Fullerton, and Long Beach City College. He's been a consultant not only at LAEDC, but also for members of Congress. So it is such an honor, Stephen and Nando, to have you both with us today. I'm going to turn it over to now Stephen, who will moderate this discussion, and then before we go into questions. Thank you so much, Stephen and Ferdinando. Stephen, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Richard. Good afternoon. Good to see everybody. And Nando, good to see you.
Great to see you, Stephen.
We're going to turn this into just a dialogue and later on open up for questions from the audience. But I suggest to the audience members, if you can start thinking about your questions, start typing in the Q&A, and I'll start incorporating them shortly. Let's get into it, Nando. So what a year it's been so far, and everything is changing very quickly. We'll get into all the details, but first, just to set the stage, can you talk a little bit about why this is important to us at this point, right? I think for those of us who are well steeped into international trade, we know the importance of Port of LA, Port of Long Beach, and just the Los Angeles Customs District as a whole. But to the audience, if you can just basically help us get a sense, why does this matter to folks? Why does trade matter to folks? And not only for us in Los Angeles, Long Beach, but the region, the states, and actually to the entire nation. How are we impacting the rest of the nation?
Absolutely. So it's never been, in my opinion, more important to understand how impactful, obviously, the ports are and the entire goods movement and industry cluster that you obviously are so familiar with. And your organization just a couple of weeks ago published an analysis that is just fantastic and very comprehensive. And kudos to you and the team. Fantastic study. So the Port of Long Beach actually we just completed our own economic impact analysis project that started actually back in August. So it's been quite some time working directly with our consultant EBP based in Boston. And so what I would like to first do, I think, to set the stage, I think it would be, put everything in proper context and perspective, is just give a very short presentation to start on the results of that economic impact analysis. So let me share my screen. And hopefully everyone can see my screen.
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great. Okay, so just a quick short presentation. Back in 2019 was the last iteration that it was completed. And of course, now this is 2025, so that was 6 years ago. That last analysis was based on 2017 data. This analysis is based on 2023 data. So let's take a look at the okay, so I'm going to do a quick overview of the project, and what are we actually trying to achieve and do with this, and then of course focus on the final slides and the key findings. And so this is not only an economic impact analysis, but also a fiscal impact analysis. I think that's very important to point out, to understand the economic contributions and from the fiscal standpoint as well. And we know how ever important that is becoming, especially on the state level. So what we've done is basically look at the categories of impacts broken down into port users, the importers and exporters, the port activity or port industry. So that's our tenants, and also the harbor department overall. And then the other category that we measured the impacts that are derived from the construction expenditures for the fiscal year, and tourism related. Of course, that's going to be the Queen Mary and the Carnival Cruise Line that of course are at the Port of Long Beach as well. And then we analyzed it with respect to 4 different regions this time, starting with the Los Angeles Metropolitan Statistical Area, which is Los Angeles, Long Beach, Anaheim, which comprises, of course, is comprised of LA County and Orange County. And then the 5-county region, LA County, Orange County, Riverside, San Bernardino, and Ventura counties. And then, of course, for the state itself overall, and then the entire United States. And we looked again at the economic and fiscal. The economic side of things, we're looking, of course, at jobs, employment, incomes, wages, value added, the gross product that we're so familiar with, total output, and then the taxes that are generated at the local, state, and federal level. So the economic impacts are looking at 3 different types of effects. Of course, the direct effects, the indirect effects. That's, of course, every industry needs to be fed by suppliers, and that's where the indirect effects are coming from. And then the induced effects, which are essentially all of the spending that is a result of the incomes that are generated from the direct and indirect effects. And with that said, here are the overall employment totals by the 4 different regions. And you can see that the Port of Long Beach contributes over 543,000 jobs in LA and Orange counties, nearly 700,000 at the 5-county level, and then over 1.1 million jobs in the state of California, and then over 2.7 million for the entire nation. And I'll come back to the significance and importance of the California and the US numbers in particular, of how we reach every assembly district, Senate district in the state, and then every congressional district in the United States. This just breaks it down again by the type and the direct and the totals, which of course are the indirect and induced totals included as well. And then as a percentage of the total employment for each of the areas as well. And next, let me get to some of the political geography in these next 3 slides. So starting with the state of California, and as you can see here, the darker shades of red represent the largest amount of trade that's taking place, 2-way trade, both imports and exports. Of course, starting with our LA metro area, the 5-county, but of course, including the big part of the Central Valley and those agricultural exports, but even the Bay Area as well. So every state assembly district, as I mentioned before, and Senate district are utilizing, and we are touching and creating significant economic impacts throughout the state. Over 1.1 million jobs related to the port. Then looking at it from a county standpoint and looking at it nationally, what you can see here is there are very few counties throughout the United States where there's no reported trade. But what you will see from this map, again, that darker shade of red represents where the most trade is taking place. And as you can see, it's not just the Southern California and the Southwestern region, but even beyond, that critical point, like essentially Denver and Dallas, where we still are maintaining that discretionary cargo that is so critical. Of course, Chicago and the Ohio Valley, and then even the New York, New Jersey, tri-state area, all the way even into southern Florida. And in fact, even as you can see, the counties in southern Florida as well. So throughout the entire United States, and these on the right-hand side of the slide, you see which states are actually utilizing the Port of Long Beach the most. And even New York is on there. Of course, you have Chicago, and you have all of the key metropolitan areas throughout the United States. So we really are such a critical engine, not just for Southern California, but the entire nation. And of course, that's the case for both ports, obviously. And then looking at this particular map is what is so important to point out is even though there are some white areas, it does, that's from 0 to 5 million. It is not zero. It is actually, there is trade taking place, and we are touching every congressional district, just like it was the case the last time we completed this study. And that's very important to point out again, that we're maintaining that discretionary cargo even post COVID, because this is based on 2023 data. So very, very important to understand that, and especially from an economic standpoint of how critical of an engine we are, not again, just locally or at statewide, but nationally. And then most importantly, what are the key findings? Again, the jobs totals and putting it into perspective of the percentage of total jobs for the LAMSA, 5-county, California, and the US. And it's essentially 1 out of every 17 jobs in LA and Orange County is related to the Port of Long Beach, and 1 out of every 17 for the 5-county region, and 1 out of every 22 for California. From a gross product standpoint, billions of dollars, over 141 billion, state of California, which represents about 4% of total gross state product. And then the fiscal side as well, which is so important. Of course, over 20 billion in LAMSA, to almost 25 in the 5-county, and then over 42 billion for the state of California. So undoubtedly, the numbers speak for themselves, just like the LAEDC report that came out a few weeks ago as well. And then there's another study that just came out as well that the PMSA put out with S&P Global that analyzed and looked at the total economic impacts of all the West Coast ports. So the timeliness is extremely important of these studies coming out, because it just reiterates what we all know, here in Southern California. But I think it's so important right now, as I mentioned earlier, to really understand, based on the current U.S. trade policy, what is really at stake for the entire nation, beyond looking at things right from what it's going to mean for prices for consumers, and of course for U.S. companies and everything that they import to allow them to remain competitive, which we'll get into later. But it's just so important for all of us, and that's why I'm so happy that Stephen is part of this, and the LAEDC and the work that they do, and of course the World Trade Center. We have to have that united front, and it's been wonderful to see, how strong the effort has been in recent days, and especially the last couple of weeks. And so, one other last thing that I want to point out and put things into proper context, and then we'll move on with the discussion, is we have to remember that the LAMSA includes LA County and Orange County. And as Stephen knows so well, LA County has the largest county economy in the United States. And the LAMSA, LA County and Orange County together, if they were a country, we would have the 18th largest economy in the world. I mean, that's extraordinary. And the 5-county region would be the 17th largest economy in the world. And California just became the 4th largest economy in the world. And a big reason, a big part of that is in fact due and related to everything that I was just going through, and how significant and important the international trade and the entire trade-related industry cluster is, and also for Asia, and what is at stake for those nations as they're trying to develop and pursue their export-led development policies, and then how much potential there is there being the Asian century and how we can grow together and have been growing together, particularly China and California and Southern California. So lots to get to and understand and really emphasize. But the bottom line is, these numbers speak for themselves. The economic contributions of the ports and everything then that is derived as a result of what's happening at the ports these are people's lives that are at stake, livelihoods, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of jobs and millions of jobs throughout the United States. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and we can now have a lively discussion with Stephen.
Excellent, excellent. Nando, thank you so much for the data information. I'm a data nerd, so I always like to see the fact and figures so we can put it in context. Now, I'm also tracking the Q&A. Audience members, I don't see any questions. It's time for you to start thinking through what questions you have, because I have a ton. I don't want to dominate all the time, so start putting it in there. Nando, let's step back a little bit with the data that you provided for the impact of Port of Long Beach, which is amazingly impressive. And I think sometimes people forget. You were also mentioning that LAEDC, we released a report. So let me add a little bit flavor to this. We did something similar, but we also looked at the total impact besides the Port of Long Beach, but also Port of LA, but the entire trade and logistics sector. So combined together, the way that we're looking at it, and even on a conservative sense, the industry for the trade and logistics sector in Southern California is contributing close to $500 billion. $497.6 billion in economic output for the entire region. And again, the job numbers that you have coincides with what we're looking at as well. The industry directly employed about 902,000 workers, and the indirect and induced numbers are now 2 million workers for the entire 5-county region. And the other thing that we're looking at as well is not just because of the number of jobs, but also the quality of the jobs. Average wage for this sector, for the trade and logistics sector, especially for Port of LA, Port of Long Beach, is over 90,000 average wage, compared to the average wage for the region, which is about $71,000. That's about a 26% higher level than the average wage for the region. That's the power of this entire sector. And I think sometimes people take what the Port of LA, Port of Long Beach, and the trade and logistics sector do for granted, and we didn't really pay attention to it until COVID. And when we saw that if there's any disruption to these twin ports, the rest of the nation, they can't move forward. Just in context, right? Now, new context. This year again, what a year. Over the last 5 months, it's been up and down. Every day is a different type of news. And what we're seeing is that the world is responding to our perhaps negotiation tactic. And a lot of folks are seeing, is the US moving towards a more protectionist stance? And if that's the case, what are the consequences? We talked about the potential economic impact, but are there additional consequences besides economics? Nana?
No, it's such a great question. Let me preface before we continue and before I forget and potentially get in trouble. Now I'm going to be putting on a different hat and a different set of glasses, and that's going to be my professor hat on, and no longer representing the port, because I don't want to be, misconstrued in any way with respect to my comments. Not that I'm going to be political at all, because we want to, and the key is to keep it in essentially focus on the economics. And unfortunately, as I've been explaining to my students for almost 20 years now, you cannot separate politics from economics, and there's no better example than tariffs. So much on the line, and I'm glad you asked this question because it's really important to understand what is at stake, not just economically. But let me first focus on the economic side of things, right? And not based on opinion and not just based on theory, right? because it's all about the practical side of things, the reality. And what have we seen throughout? One of the classes that I've been teaching is American economic history. And if you look closely, essentially since the 1800s, what has taken place, right? We have the empirical evidence. We just need to look to history. And there's never been a time where, from an economic standpoint, it has not led to more inflation, less jobs on a net basis, right? It will create jobs in particular industries. The aluminum and steel are the perfect example. We can come back to those. But it's always led to higher unemployment, lower growth, and it's never produced the economic benefits that are what the stated objective is. And I think it's very important to really point that out. And in fact, since the 19th century, the 1800s, the US has experienced 6 economic depressions, and all but one were either directly caused or significantly worsened by tariffs. And especially when we always hear about the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930, right, that are always referenced. Those lasted until 1934. And what did those do, and what did that create? Unfortunately, it led to a worsening of the Great Depression, and it led to, unfortunately, that period of protectionism and isolationism ultimately led to World War II. So there's so much more at stake than just the economics. So what are those things, right? It's always triggered a movement towards, again, isolationism, that nationalism that then triggers and leads to that political extremism that we've seen throughout history. It's created a movement away from multilateralism and less globalism, and a more fractured world, leading to more conflicts. So it has the geopolitical implications and the international relations implications, and it's always led to more destabilization throughout the world. And I think that is being the LA World Affairs Council, right, and understanding this, and that there's so much more than the economic impacts. And it's really, from a global standpoint, geopolitically, international relations, and what then that could lead to, and how problematic that has been throughout history.
Nando, that's not good news. You're scaring me. Uh, I'm usually just focused on kind of the economic side, but you're right. There's so many different things are at stake. We're also tracking other things that are being impacted right now. Part of the report that we also did is to look at foreign direct investments in this region. And recently, we released another foreign direct investment report, quantifying there are about 18,000 foreign-owned enterprises here in California, contributing to about 800,000 direct jobs. So it's fantastic that so many international corporations and countries have selected California and the Los Angeles region as their investment and creating all these great jobs for this region. In our trade and logistics report, we also found that there are over 2,000 foreign-owned enterprises in the trade and logistics sector alone in the 5-county region, directly employing 67,000 people and paying about $5.8 billion in wages annually. So, speaking of the protectionism, I think sometimes when we just talk about trade, we're not looking at the other consequences. Are there any potential in terms of countries that are saying, well, if you're not welcoming us, then why should we invest in here? And what are some of those potential implications?
I'm so glad you brought up foreign direct investment. And I know how passionate and how important that has been for you, over the last 10 years, and the great work that you have done, at the LAEDC with these investment summits. Unfortunately, I was not able to attend last Thursday, and I was really looking forward to having that opportunity to attend. And it's so critical that is, again, it's not just with respect to trade. One factoid that is very important to understand is that 25% of US exports come from foreign-owned companies here in the United States. So there's a direct correlation between trade and foreign direct investment attraction. And, as your report points out and demonstrates, there are over 800,000 jobs in California and almost 500,000 in Southern California alone from FDI. And we are the international trade capital of the US, and we're also the #1 source of foreign direct investment attraction in the United States. So there is so much at stake, and we've seen it, right, since the 70s, right? It all started with Japan and us, of course, importing a lot from Japan. And then, of course, then that turning into substantial foreign investment from Japanese companies into the United States. And now so many of the cars, right, or whether it's Honda, Toyota, are actually manufactured here in the United States. And there's so many Japanese companies. And then it was South Korea, same thing. And then it was China, as you very well know. And then there was this onslaught of foreign direct investment from China that you and Bill Allen have played such a vital role over the last, at least 15 years or so, and how beneficial that has been to Southern California and to Los Angeles County in particular. Not only companies starting to come, but of course the real estate investment, and then of course there's also the students, the number of Chinese students that have come to our local universities and how beneficial that has been. So it's not just about trade, but the way in which it also impacts foreign direct investment. And what I would love to be able to ask you is, from your event last Thursday and your conversations, right? What have you been hearing, or what was heard that day, of course, in recent weeks, with respect to the trepidations of countries and companies wanting to come here to California, and what their fears and concerns are, and how much of that we could be losing going forward, in particular, especially with respect to what's happening with China?
Yeah. I want to expand to more than China. That's a great question. So it's beyond just Select LA, the investment summit, which is we try to invite a lot of international partners. But even before that, World Trade Center LA, we host a lot of international delegation. I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I'll let you know that there are a couple delegations that we're expecting, over 20 companies coming in, looking into investing in Southern California and the LA region. Half of the delegation didn't show up because they were hearing all the chatter about potentially being detained at the border. And they're not going to basically want to fly all the way over here and have the risk of actually being turned away or detained. So they just basically, even though they're ready to invest and create jobs here, they just stop because of the trepidation that they're facing, and they're also worried. So this is now being multiplied over and over again from various nations. So that's the direct impact that we're seeing. It was a very successful Select LA. However, we did not see the number of investors international investors that we're seeing. And I want to give the good, bad, and the ugly as well, because I don't want it to be a whole situation as Chicken Little. We didn't see the number of Chinese investors that we usually see. However, we saw an increase in companies coming from Taiwan. I think there are certain countries that are hearing the potential challenges, but also saw the opportunity that they need to really be double downing and making sure that they have operations here. So one of those sectors and one of those countries, I think we've been hearing Japan and the US, especially with the president and meeting with the prime minister, and they're saying that there's going to be a $1 trillion investment coming from Japan into the United States. That's good news, and we're hoping that's going to basically be realized very soon. However, this is where I'm going to tie in with another sector, tourism. In 2023 to 2024, we saw a huge increase in Japanese tourists coming into Los Angeles. In fact, we saw a 91% increase. And the surprising thing is, 80 to 90% of those visitors that came from Japan, 80 to 90% of them went to one or more Dodger game. It was the Ohtani effect. Ohtani is now driving this entire ecosystem. So that's a positive. However, in 2025, what we heard is because of the the tariff situation, Canada actually canceled 70% of the flights coming into the US from, I think about March, April into October. That's something like 300,000 seats or less that will be coming into the United States because of boycotts and because of kind of various kind of sentiments. You've seen advertising now in Palm Springs, for example. They're afraid of the snowbirds leaving. So they're saying they have a big campaign that basically says, Palm Springs loves Canadians, please come back, right? I mentioned that is because if this continues to basically be expanded to other regions like Japan, that's going to be a huge loss for us when it comes to tourism in this entire region, not only for Los Angeles, but California as a whole. So that's a long way of answering your question in terms of the impact that we're seeing is now trickling down into not only investments, but also tourists. And when tourists are coming, that usually ties in with potential opportunity because you have business travelers as well. So this is a whole slew of things that are coming together, adding to what you're mentioning before about potential negative consequences to protectionism. So, again, we can talk about it forever. I will switch topic, and I just want to thank the first question. Judy, thank you for your question. We'll get to yours quickly. I want to talk a little bit about even getting to the point of where we're at right now to be able to talk about California being the fourth largest economy or the 5-county region being the 17th largest economy. A lot of it has to do with our role in Los Angeles and California as the center for international investment, the center for international trade. But in order for us to basically get there, it really has been driven by trade liberalization and free trade policies that have actually propelled our region. But also in many ways, it's actually been driven by the United States. After World War II, as the U.S. that really led the world in terms of pushing for trade liberalization. Can you give us a bit more background in terms of how do we get to this point of actually positioning Port of Long Beach and the Port of LA as the busiest container ports in the Western Hemisphere since 2001? Give us that context.
Yes,
How do we get
and I promise I will try to be very brief and succinct because obviously we could be very long-winded on this answer. There's so much to understand, and I want to get to the other questions. But I'm so glad you mentioned 2001. Okay, so what happened, and it's the key year. What happened in 2001? So China joined the World Trade Organization. Okay, let's remember that the World Trade Organization was created in 1947 as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, as it was known. And it was created after World War II, as you mentioned, Stephen, just like the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF. And there was a very critical reason for those institutions being created, okay? And that was specifically to create an integrated, prosperous, and stable global economy and financial system. And of course, to help facilitate global capitalism, global cooperation, and free trade, and increase the likelihood of global security and peace, of course, after 2 world wars. And 2001 was the turning point because what that allowed for to happen is by China joining the World Trade Organization and pursuing trade liberalization and lowering those barriers to trade, and in particular tariffs, and allowing for U.S. companies to come into China as well. What it did, our ports became the busiest ports in the U.S. essentially because of China joining the WTO. Since 2001, I think with the exception of 2023, I think Port of Long Beach was surpassed by New York, but we won't mention that. But again, we're the 2 busiest ports in the United States, and that's been the case for the last 24 years. And that has been because of China's economic rise and China becoming the factory to the world, and the Chinese, of course, the surge in Chinese imports, obviously coming into the United States and of course coming through our ports. So all of those numbers I mentioned earlier and all of these economic impacts, all right, are essentially the majority of those by far are a result of our trading with China and China's economic rise. And for us at the Port of Long Beach, roughly 68% of all our containerized imports are from China. So we really have the most, and we've been the greatest beneficiary, but we also, with that said, have the most to lose in this trade war with China. The majority of all the economic benefits that I mentioned, again, were created and are created by trade with China. And China's economic rise, and at the same time, we have had the most to gain, and we have benefited greatly, Southern California and California, for how essentially how interconnected California is to the rest of the world. It's one of the key reasons why, of course, we are the fourth largest economy. And we've also benefited not only by having Chinese imports and, and of course, lower priced goods, not only final consumer goods, but also intermediate inputs. But also, we've greatly benefited over the years as China has developed a larger and larger middle class with respect to our exports. And I was just looking at those numbers as well. We essentially, unfortunately, the last few years, it's gone down. I think it was roughly 18, and now it's closer to 15 billion, I think was last year's numbers. But you have to remember, for every $1 billion of exports, that equates into 5,000 to 7,000 jobs. So that's another critical job generator and economic engine as well, in addition to everything that I mentioned earlier as well. And then, of course, all of the FDI benefits and investment benefits. So it's so important to understand and go back to at the end of World War II, what was created by the United States that I'm always discussing in my classes and lecturing about is the world in which that was created and we've experienced over the last 80 years, right, was essentially one of the key components of that was of course, the movement towards and of course facilitating global capitalism and free trade and free enterprise and open markets, and to create, starting with Europe and of course with the European Union, and then of course also obviously what has transpired throughout the world and how these countries like Japan, South Korea, and China, as the three best examples, utilizing an export-led economic development strategy and model, and what that has done for those countries. And now, what is so important to really understand as well is, I think we can all agree, and undoubtedly this is going to be the Asian century. And what do I mean by that is the most significant amount of global growth that is going to take place over the next 25 years is going to take place in Asia. Of course, China and India, but also Southeast Asia. And that is so important to understand as well, particularly Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand. And those are all of our top trading partners. But that growth is entirely predicated upon those countries being able to implement and pursue those export-led development models. And a majority of those exports would be coming to the United States and be coming through our ports over the next 25 years. In addition, with that said, it presents such a great opportunity. And I think, what is so critical for the current administration is trying to increase U.S. exports. And we all want that to be accomplished. We all want that, we're all on the same page when it comes to that. But that's why these tariffs also are so counterproductive, because you have retaliation. And then if you're moving away from trade liberalization, that is going to negatively impact us on the export opportunities, especially if those countries are not able to achieve that economic growth via that export-led model. And then as they export, obviously their incomes will increase, the larger middle class, and they'll be able to buy more of our exports. And so there's so much potential on that side as well for our ports. And we can't lose sight of that and how much is at stake there as well.
Nando, as you're talking about that, again, to your point, there's so much at stake. And one of the things that it reminded me of is previously, in order for us to continue with these trade policies and to basically have preferential status with some of our trading partners, our largest trading partners, we use trade agreements, and we entered into multilateral trade agreements, or at least try to, including Trans-Pacific Partnership and TTIP and other things that, went different ways. However, we also saw that when we walked away from those trade agreements, China didn't walk away from their trade agreements. They continued to basically build this relationship with other Asian nations, including RCEP and other things that they've been doing, so that they can have that more favorable relationship. Tell us, what is at stake now for the US and for us in Los Angeles in particular, if the US and the rest of Asia continues down this road of protectionism? What does that mean for us in our future?
Such an important question. And I'm so glad you mentioned the TPP. Let me preface by saying, let's rewind, let's go back to leading up to 2015, right? Because obviously the last 10 years is where everything has really changed significantly with respect to US trade policies. But up until 2015, and I remember being at the LAEDC and working with the Korean consulate and COTRA. You had of course, KORUS, the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, 2012, South Korea, Panama, and Colombia. And with that, at that same time, they were in negotiations and finalizing the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which would have been the United States and 11 other Pacific Rim countries. And it would have been the United States essentially dictating the rules and the way trade was going to be conducted in that part of the world that I just mentioned. That is where the future is going to be, the epicenter of economic global growth. And we did not, we finalized it, it was done. And then it was the first action that was taken in Trump 1.0, was the very first thing that was done, was to put that free trade agreement to an end. And I think what you mentioning free trade agreements, right? And I want to really emphasize this, because it's not just about, and I understand it has to be free, but also fair, and have free and fair trade agreements. And that's what we should be pursuing. And we should be taking the route of trying to educate the public, as difficult as it might be, because again, it's all politics, and the easy route to take is, of course, to do what politically makes sense. And that has always been, over the last 10 years, of course, is you have to be seen as being politically, being tough on China and trying to bring those manufacturing jobs, particularly into the Rust Belt states, and bringing manufacturing jobs back, right? And it sounds so good, right? But those jobs are not coming back. And what we should be focusing on is, right, what is trade all about? It's all about comparative advantage. Where are revealed comparative advantages? And that's what we should be focusing on, and the industries of the future. And we should be dominating in those areas and then exporting those particular goods. I think that's what is so important. And it's not just this idea of trying to lower the amount that we're importing and increase our exports. Of course, we want to increase our exports, but we have to understand the benefits of importing and why it's so beneficial, right? For US consumers, but also for US companies, right? By putting these tariffs in place, you're negatively impacting, like I mentioned before, our export potential. And I think that is so important to understand. And we're decreasing our exports, and again, are reducing our FDI opportunities as well. And our current trade policies, not just from a theoretical standpoint, but from empirical evidence, they're counterproductive, and they're going to be very damaging to our economy and international relations, like I mentioned earlier. And what we need to do and get back to is understanding the benefits of free trade, having free trade, but also fair trade, and high labor standards, environmental standards. And the TPP was going to achieve that. Of course, I know the TPP was controversial, but with that, by not pursuing that, not taking the lead, we essentially have handed China on a silver platter the opportunity to then be the ones who are leading, dictating the rules of the game in that part of the world, in that region of the world. And that's, in my opinion, was a very big mistake. and we continue to go down this road of protectionism and this economic nationalism and isolationism. And again, throughout history, that has never been beneficial for the United States. And we're an advanced economy, right? This whole idea of significant large trade deficits that country is taking advantage of us is just does not make any sense, right? A country like Vietnam is not going to be able to be purchasing and buying as much as we purchase and buy from Vietnam, right? An emerging, developing economy. We have greatly benefited in many, many ways, and even imports actually create millions of jobs. And that's not really focused on enough as well, right? So it's so important. What really needs to happen and take place is we need profiles of courage. We need strong leadership that is going to try and really emphasize and get the public to understand the benefits and not just see trade in such a negative fashion and way, but instead try to educate the public on why we should be pursuing free trade and free trade agreements. And I think that is going to be so desperately needed as we move forward. But again, it's all politics. It's not about the economics and the economic benefits. It's just purely based on politics, unfortunately.
And before we have a couple minutes left before I jump to the last question, I want to jump to the audience question. Judy was asking, since tariff increases were first announced, has there been a reduction in jobs at the ports?
We have just last week, we really started to actually see how impactful, both at the Port of LA and the Port of Long Beach, significant declines in the number of ships coming in. And of course, what that meant just last week, starting, of course, with the longshoremen, and of course, what it did to the truck drivers and trucking industry. Luckily, right, Monday, we received good news, and there's this, from 145% to 30%. And of course, China reducing theirs from 125 to 10%. And we have this 90-day pause now. And again, there's a couple of critical dates that we all need to be mindful of when those 90-day, there's the reciprocal tariffs 90-day pause ends July 9th. And then August 12th would be the 90-day pause on the tariffs with China. So again, we would have seen undoubtedly, and I think that was, really understood and realized by the administration of what it was really going to mean. And luckily, there was some progress made, and I think that will help. But still, at the same time, it's 30%. We have the critical periods coming up now with respect to back to school, summer fashion, and back to school, and then of course the holidays coming and that peak season. So we are going to definitely see a decrease, a decline. We already have, and that of course undoubtedly is going to translate. And just like we've seen with the 3 studies since 2004, I believe that we have done, as trade has increased, of course, the economic impacts, benefits, and fiscal impacts have increased. There's no doubt about that. I know there's a figure that's been highly referenced with respect to every 4 containers creates a job, right? Every $1 billion of exports is equivalent to 5,000 to 7,000 jobs. So you can do the math. If there's a substantial decrease, we are going to see significant job losses and revenue losses that are so desperately needed right now, especially at the state level. So there is so much at stake in people's livelihoods. And as Stephen mentioned, these are, from a workforce development standpoint, these are higher paying jobs that don't necessarily require a lot of education and have allowed a lot of people to enter into the middle class in Southern California and throughout California and the US. And that is so critical. And remember what that would do and the ripple effects of job losses, what that means to the overall economy as well. So we have definitely seen already, but on a very, in a very short period of time, the real effects were happening last week.
Yeah.
Luckily, this will help, but at the same time, you're definitely going to see a reduction in jobs. There's
Yeah.
no doubt about it.
And Jonathan is asking, are the reduced Chinese imports compensated by increased imports from countries like Vietnam?
So great question. And this is what is so important to understand. Last time around, back in 2018-19, we saw about a 20% drop in Chinese imports. Remember, those were, I think, 25% tariff on about $300 billion worth of goods. This is everything, and it was at 145%. What happened last time is you just saw those goods being sourced instead from China, mainly from Vietnam. And we saw at least, I think it was close to 15% increase from imports from Vietnam. And then we also saw some from an increases in Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia as well. So you saw that movement primarily to Southeast Asia, also some to Mexico as well, to make up for for that decline in Chinese imports this time around. And that's why that July 9th date is so critical. And the reciprocal tariffs that were announced back on April 2nd is, if you remember, that rate, particularly for Vietnam, because that's our next key import partner for the Port of Long Beach, is that percentage was going to go up to 46%. And that still could be the case on July 9th. If that happens, that's a game changer for us. And that's what we are, for me, that is going to be the critical aspect of all of this. If it's just China, it's one thing. But even with that said, there will be damage from that as well, because you have to remember, you cannot necessarily just start sourcing, right, significant amounts of imports from other countries. They just don't necessarily have the capacity, whether it's from, obviously from a production standpoint, but the infrastructure as well to handle that influx. And it takes years, right? So the impacts of the supply chains are very significant, and it would take years to be able to reconcile and rectify that situation.
So we're out of time, but Roger just popped in the last question here. If you can answer this question in 1 minute. Roger asked, what is the relationship between the national debt and trade imbalance?
Good, very good question, right? So why do we have such significant trade deficits? And I think what it really comes down to is, and the big differences between countries as well, is our savings and our saving rates, right? Much more significant and higher in other countries than in the United States. And that's, a big issue, of course, and that's what really is contributing to these great significant trade deficits. And of course, the national debt, is part of that and playing a part of that with respect to the trade deficits, and the lack of savings, I think, is so important. And I think we have to, of course, do a better job and be more focused on what that means, how that affects interest rates, how that affects the dollar, and of course, how that impacts ultimately trade.
Great. Thank you, Nando. You're right on time. Dr. Dan is showing up to pull us off the stage.
We still have 2 minutes, Richard. Come on.
No. There's no hook here, Stephen and Nando. This was I feel like a villain, but for doing this, for showing up here like this. But I want to thank both of you. This is really wonderful. For those of us who are not economists or experts in international trade, as you both are, this is a very daunting kind of idea. So I really want to thank each of you for helping us to kind of sort through and explain some of these impacts, because as I mentioned, because those of us who are not experts in tariffs, it's terrifying. And Stephen, you mentioned this earlier. It's really scary, some of these things for us that don't understand it. So having you both help to explain it is very helpful. I just appreciate so much. If we were all here, I'd ask our audience to help me give a huge round of applause for Stephen Cheung, the CEO and president of the LAEDC and World Trade Center, and for Ferdinando Guerra, who is the senior economist and geopolitical analyst at the Port of Long Beach. But this is a topic that clearly is is not going away. You've helped explain what's been going on, and you've talked about the potential for what could happen in the future. This is a topic we're going to have to revisit, and I hope you will both join us again, because again, having you guys explain this to us, those of us who are not experts in this field, is just it's reassuring to know that you guys understand it and can explain it to us. So I thank you both. I look forward to having you guys back, and I want to thank all of our audience members, especially those who were brave enough to ask questions. It's as I say, this is daunting. So thank you guys for asking questions, and we look forward to doing this again. But I thank all of you, especially Nando and Stephen. Thank you both so much. We're honored to have you both, and for a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much. You guys all have a nice evening tonight.
Thank you so much, Richard. And thank you, Stephen, for being such a great champion for so many years of, and ensuring that Southern California is connected to the rest of the world.
This is true.
Which is so important. Thank you both.
We appreciate it. Good night now.